But first of all, thank you all for being here. If you don't know me, my name is Dylan. I am on the Safe Campuses team here at Safe Project. Today we're going to do a student webinar about, as you can see on the screen, navigating failure and setbacks as a student leader. Of course, I'll turn it over to our speaker here in a minute in order to kind of do a little bit more of that introduction. But yeah, at first, I guess to introduce our speaker, who I have known now. I've known of James for, oh gosh, since 2012, 2013 was when I met James. It was my freshman year at Ohio State. I believe it was your senior year, James, or was that your junior year?
I believe that was the junior year at the time. Yeah.
So I was a junior, somehow found myself in a senior capstone leadership class. And James was like the dude in the room. Like him and the professor clearly got along. He was clearly really, really good at what he did. Was a student leader. So I was like admiring from afar. I then continued on to become a student leader myself and kind of was budding in my own way at Ohio State. Meanwhile, James is going to grad school at Ohio State, is getting professional jobs at Ohio State, is teaching all of the RAs, which I was at the time, all of us, all the things about wellness, and was just like being a model on campus in a way that we would say like the James Larcus, or ooh, what's that James dude doing? Because he just kept going up and up and up and doing things that we didn't even know if we could ever do. And then when I was getting interviewed for my first professional job, I was surprised to see that James was the person interviewing me for that job. And neither of us knew it until we finally met face to face during an on-campus interview. So it's a bit ironic that if I would have told myself in 2013 that either of us would be where we are now, I wouldn't have believed you, but also that the dude who I looked up to and was like perfect in my eyes would be the one giving a webinar on failure. I wouldn't have believed you. And so, yeah, I'm excited to turn it over to James, and thanks for being here, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for being here, everyone. I know it's a busy time of the year, especially for you as students might be experiencing. Here, I work at the University of Denver. We're on a quarter system, so they're wrapping up. But most of you all, I'm assuming, are in semesters, and it's midterms. So there's a lot going on, and I appreciate you all kind of being here today. And my goal as a facilitator, with an exclamation point, not a question mark, that as I put in the chat, is really just to create a space and to chat about some topics that are hopefully relevant and important to each of us in the ways that we are showing up. But at the same time, I really try to just create, if you can just take one nugget or just take away from this, that's what I hope to do. There's going to be some, content that I share just based off of my own experience, but I really hope that you can ground it in your own and we can engage in some good dialogue here at the end. So as Dylan mentioned, the presentation here is called Mind Mishaps and the F Word, Navigating Failure and Setbacks as a Student Leader. And in full transparency, I shared this with our group before we jumped on and sort of started the webinar. This is a new presentation for me. It's sort of a combination of a bunch of ideas that I've been kicking around for a while, but I've never had sort of an explicit presentation on sort of failure and sort of the ways maybe we can move forward. So in some ways, maybe I'll fail today, I'm not sure, but it'll be a learning experience, hopefully for all of us. But I'm excited to join in with you all. And I know some people are sort of throwing stuff in the chat right now. And if you all feel comfortable, maybe throw in something that sort of intrigued you to maybe click on this session to register and or maybe an outcome that you'd like to see, so I can maybe sort of tailor anything that I'm sharing to hit what you all are wanting as a community. So I appreciate to have the space here with you all. All right, jumping in. So here's a little bit about me. Dylan gave an intro and it's much appreciated. It is a small world that we've kind of come full circle to get to this place. But my name is James Larcus. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm project manager for strategic initiatives within the Health and Counseling Center at the University of Denver, which is where Dylan and I reconnected in his time as he sort of launched our efforts for recovery on campus. But also I'm kind of coming to you with a separate identity as well, sort of starting my own sort of practice around well-being and coaching and trying to bring sort of the science of well-being to various populations. So kind of bringing those dual roles together. But I'm happy to have served a variety of campus populations and currently at the University of Denver. I teach at Metro State University, which is a university here in town. And my main gig is at the University of Denver, supporting our health and well-being efforts on campus. All right, so to give you a quick little overview of what we're going to accomplish today, or hope to accomplish, right? I'll start just sort of with your theme. The theme of that I was sort of told of these webinars is sort of the power of your story and sort of the narrative that we all carry. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a story, sort of a fictitious story that hopefully we can connect to. I'm going to connect that story to some other stories that are out there, especially as it relates to failure. Then we're going to get into what I call mind mishaps, just ways that our brain is sort of wired to potentially preclude our ability to maybe accept failure or lean into failure, or even to achieve sort of higher levels of well-being that I think each of us in some way or another are seeking to move towards. So we'll talk about those mind mishaps in particular. Hopefully we'll get some takeaways, and then we'll open it up for a dialogue. And I know we have a wonderful sort of group here, and I'm hoping that we can make this useful for you all. All right, so first, let's start with the story. And forewarning, this is sort of a fictitious and maybe cheesy story, but hopefully it'll connect and resonate in some way. So my friend here on the screen, his name is Giga. That's what we're going to call him today. And Giga is a character in a new video game called Data Crunch. In this game, Giga's objectives is to navigate a new digital landscape and to find bits of data along the way. Each bit of that data Giga finds will help unlock new levels, new experiences that they may explore. The ultimate aim for Giga is to collect as much information and process it in sort of in the correct way so that they may unlock hidden bits of information stored on one of the drives. As Giga gets started, they've started their mission, but they have hit some roadblocks. They've made it past the first few levels at ease, but cannot get past one level in particular. They've tried 20, 25 times, yet still shut down, and they need to reboot and try again. Along the way, Giga meets two other characters, Terra and Mega, who offer help and advice. After avoiding at first and thinking it would kind of drag out the process, maybe isn't the direction that they should go, Giga goes back, but Terra and Mega have moved on. Finally, Giga figures out a way to break through. Yet, when met with the next puzzle or the next bit of information to find, they realize that the challenge is even harder than the first. The challenge is so hard that when Giga has to reboot or restart, they even miss little pieces of information that came easy at first, that allowed them to get over the first hurdle. Giga is really starting to doubt their ability to achieve their ultimate goal. And the question becomes, can Giga do it? So starting with a story, but I really wanted to sort of connect a story to others. And so how does Giga's story relate to others in particular? So I want to bring up two examples. As you can see in Giga's story, there was some failure, there's some roadblocks, there were some setbacks that they might have faced, some things that they navigated, and some things they're still trying to navigate. But I wanted to sort of connect Giga's story and the resonation with hitting roadblocks or potential failures to a couple maybe characters or people that we maybe know in pop culture. The first on the left, we have Steven Spielberg. And we know him primarily from movies such as Jurassic Park or E.T. At least that's what I, as someone who was born in the 90s, really resonates with some of those movies, but just this really prolific and well-known director and filmmaker. Similarly, we have Thomas Edison, who obviously has made a lot of contributions to the world, but maybe no more important than the light bulb. The interesting thing about these two characters and things that you may not know, maybe at least for me, I didn't know this about Steven Spielberg, but he was actually rejected to film school multiple times when he was younger. So although we know him as being sort of this big movie director and creator, he didn't get in and didn't actually hit his goal that he had at first in terms of getting into film school to take those next steps. Additionally, maybe you've heard of this one a little bit more, but Edison has a famous quote that he had not 10,000, that he had 10,000 failures before he found the light bulb. And it took him that many sort of iterations and times to actually find the probably one of the most important inventions at the time. So it took him 10,000 different tries or different sort of iterations to get to this place. So there's two monumental figures or people that we might know in pop culture who have faced setbacks and have still succeeded. So to use our example, maybe Giga can do this. Maybe he can learn from some of those experiences. Additionally, some other ways that we can connect this story. I'm not sure if anyone watched the other night. I know that my wife was very intrigued by Oprah's interview of Meghan and Prince Harry. But Oprah was actually fired from her first job, which is not something that people know. People think of her right now as just being this mega star, maybe the pinnacle of sort of what it means to be quote unquote successful in life. But she has been very open about the failures and setbacks that she has faced. And the first one that sort of I think that she really points to in particular was being fired from her first job. So the question that Giga might be asking at this point is, wait, really? Oprah? Really? But maybe there's some sources of inspiration and things that we can learn from this story as well. So we may have heard this before, but I just wanted to offer a quote, another person that maybe you think of that has been pretty outspoken about the role of failure in their life, and that's Michael Jordan. So just yet another example. And he says that I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I failed over and over and over again in my life. And that's why I succeed. It's probably one of the more famous quotes from him. But thinking about all the times that maybe the best basketball player of all time, some of you might, if you are basketball fans, might say that LeBron is a little bit better, but one of the best basketball players of all time. This is a quote that he shares and talks about a lot. That failure was really sort of critical to his success. And so I offer that both as sort of just sort of a narrative, sort of case studies of what people have been, of people we maybe put on these pedestals in terms of their success that they've had. And I think back to my own time as well, maybe in your role as student leaders, and thinking about college being just this really, or was for me at least, a really fertile time to learn, grow, and develop, whether it be sort of in my identity formation, figuring life out, just navigating a bunch of transitions of like who I want to be in the world. And I think, at least for myself, we sometimes protect ourselves from failure. We sort of beef up our emotional capacity through doing. At least I did, by doing more, taking on more projects, by trying to take on another leadership role, maybe trying to insulate myself maybe from actually having failure in my life, because I was maybe scared of it, although college provided this really unique time. So I'm kind of curious with that as a stopping point real quick, to maybe if you have any sort of thoughts or reactions to throw in the chat, like how does this resonate or not resonate with kind of your experience right now as a student leader? Sometimes I'm not sure what growth path I'm in the middle of, so it's hard to keep the process in mind. Yeah, I appreciate that feedback. I'm kind of maybe not sure where we are in that arc of our journey or in our narrative, and that can be sometimes difficult to sort of know where to go next. I appreciate that. Feel free to drop some more in there as we move along. But what I want to sort of offer to you is that maybe failure might not be so bad, or maybe not as bad as we think. Sort of these forks in the road. Sometimes we avoid them. Sometimes we're scared of them, but maybe they're actually necessary to sort of have this idea of success, or sort of to accomplish the goals and things that are most important to us. So I wanted to share a little bit about this. So I think it's one thing to always share like these people that we are in pop culture, these celebrities as sort of being at the pinnacle. Um, but there's actually some really interesting research that has been done, and I will share that I'm sort of a research nerd. Dylan will tell you this. I kind of go down rabbit holes of just like exploring ideas. So bear with me as I share some of this. But I found it interesting that it's not just celebrities. But there's actually some researchers who tried to see and maybe their hypothesis was, is failure sort of the first step to eventual success? So there's a study with a bunch of different researchers, some of which were at Northwestern University, that basically proved this scientifically with a mathematical model, that failure is the key to success. It's not just luck. It's not just maybe potential, just like ungodly talent that say Michael Jordan or someone else has. Um, but they actually sort of studied this. So they looked in a variety of different fields, and sort of saw where the people who had reached their ultimate goal and their ultimate success and the path that they got there. And what they saw is that failure was a critical component. First of all, it was pretty ubiquitous. Everyone failed in some way or another. They had a setback, they had a roadblock, they kind of made the wrong decision, they got rejected from something. Um, but the key sort of piece was how people handled that failure. So the divergence after the first failure is sort of really key. As early as the second attempt, there was really sort of clear paths of whether or not people continue to go down sort of a spiral of not meeting their goals, hitting a roadblock, sort of giving up, or the people ultimately persisted and continued to move on. And really what that was is that the path an individual took was to the extent that they learned from previous failures and how they applied that knowledge going forward. That was the critical sort of ingredient, the secret sauce, if you will, that allowed people to almost fail forward in a way that allowed them to ultimately reach their success. Um, so I say that because it's really easy for us to just like look at more again, sort of these pop culture celebrities, but in sort of more everyday life. And I will share some of the examples that they or like the industries they studied. So first they went into like science and looked at sort of grants and people who were able to get eventual funding for research projects and things that were going to impact the world. But they looked in sort of the science field. They looked at entrepreneurs in terms of getting funding for ideas and bringing products or services to life. And they even did it in a really it's weird to say, but they looked even at terrorism and terrorism sort of attempts, and who was successful and who was not. So they looked at these really vast, like very different industries as a way to say we have this hypothesis, we see this all the time, people say it in these quotes like Michael Jordan, but can we actually prove it? They came to find that it was that failure is sort of ubiquitous for most people, as well as sort of a necessary step. So I sort of offer that to you all to think about, okay, so what can maybe Giga in our story take from this? And the one thing that I would like to offer sort of as a question, hypothetically, is so why don't we embrace failure more often? Maybe it's because we're sort of protecting ourselves. There's sort of emotional, like for me, my example, I just kept doing in college because I was maybe scared of failing or not meeting um, either benchmarks that I set for myself, or maybe benchmarks that I expected, that were maybe sort of transplanted on me or that I perceived were transplanted onto me. Um, so why don't we embrace failure more if we know that maybe from these examples or even from now this like new bit of research that I just shared? Why do we maybe not embrace it? And that's where I want to get into this idea of these mind mishaps, these ways that our brains are wired to maybe feed into our ability or lack thereof of embracing failure if we know that it's ultimately going to lead us to success. So here's a quick overview. We're going to go into each of them for you all today. But the mind mishaps, the first one is our brains are wired to remember the negative more than the positive. The second is our mind's strongest intuitions are often wrong. Number 3, we judge ourselves relative to reference points. Number 4, our minds are programmed to adapt to get used to things. And 5, we don't realize number 4 is happening. So I'm going to share a little bit about what these all mean and a little bit of the research behind it, and see if it resonates with you in any sort of way. Because I know when I first found out about these, it sort of hit me like a ton of bricks, like, oh, that's maybe what's going on for me. But number 1, our brains are wired to remember the negative more so than the positive. I'm a huge soccer fan. Actually, my favorite soccer team just lost today, so I'm feeling a little down about that, to be quite honest. I was following the score as I was at work today. But I'm using a soccer example just because it resonates for me, but feel free to find something for you all as well. But I'm not sure if any of you are familiar in the 2006 World Cup, that there was sort of a big game between France and Italy. And I am Italian, so this one did work out for me. But there was a key moment in that game where probably one of the best soccer players of all time, Zinedine Zidane, who's a Frenchman here on the left, headbutted a Italian player on the right. And what's interesting is that this sort of was a big critical moment. I think was actually probably a turning point for the game. And this is also his last game playing for France. So it's kind of a big deal that this sort of mega mogul, or sort of this guy who's sort of seen at the pinnacle of the soccer world, was going to go out of the world's largest stage, the World Cup, in this way. And so to sort of highlight this point that our brains are wired to remember the negative more than the positive, although Italy ended up winning this game and the World Cup, I remember the Zinedine Zidane headbutt more than I do the win. I remember and I'm primed for the negative more so than the positive. Similarly, I think sometimes people, when they talk about him, they might say that this is the thing they point to most. If you were to ask the common person about him, they may not share all the league titles, all the sort of goals, all the even coaching accomplishments that he's had now that he's gotten older. They'll point to this moment. So our brains are really primed and wired to remember the negative more than the positive. So to kind of back this up with another example that's based in research, which proves this point, is that they have sort of sampled people who have won a bunch of money and or lost a bunch of money. So there's kind of two groups. They've won a lot of money or they lost a lot of money. And then they find that when they kind of ask them to sort of relate back their experience and sort of mark their happiness and well-being, the people who lost a lot more money they're way more upset than the people who gain money. So it's sort of priming us. So like if we lose a bunch, we remember that more than gaining anything. It just, because if we gain it, just becomes a part of our life. Whereas there's a felt loss for the people who lost a bunch of money. So there's an interesting study there that just kind of looked at people who gained a lot of money and lost a lot of money. So that's mind mishap number 1. We remember the negative more than our positive, which kind of stinks. But we'll get into maybe how we can capitalize and use that natural inclination maybe to our advantage. Mind mishap number 2 is our mind's strongest intuitions are often wrong. You can feel free to throw this in the chat. You can also just sort of for yourself, sort of just think about it. But which of these tables is bigger, the left or the right? Which table, in your opinion, is bigger? I'll give you a moment to sit with that. Maybe you are probably picking up just based on the priming, but they're actually the exact same size. If I were doing this in person, I would kind of hold up a piece of paper and kind of show you, but these are the exact same size. It's just sort of an optical illusion in terms of the surface area on top of the table. They're the exact same size. It's just sort of the way that the legs are drawn, the way that they're twisted and contorted, and the way that our brains work and our eyes work, they look a little bit different, but they're the exact same size. So again, we might feel really, really strongly. I know for me, the right one looks a lot bigger. I'm like, there's totally more surface area there, but they're actually the exact same size. If you were to just rotate it over, they are the exact, not only the surface area, but they're the exact same shape, is probably a better way to put it. I'm getting some, nah, it's definitely the left. Yeah, feel free. If we got a left camp and a right camp, but they are the exact same size. Put another way, another example to highlight this point or mind mishap is there's sort of a riddle that people say that there's a baseball bat and a ball that cost $1.10 collectively. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Bat and ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? Most people will answer this question with 10 cents and $1. But if you were to add those up together, it would actually get you $1.20. Whereas the answer to this question is the ball cost 5 cents. So our natural inclination, sort of the natural neural pathways that we have to create shortcuts for things, often maybe allows you to say, oh, if there's it's $1 more, one costs one costs the other. Let me just do simple subtraction. Boom, there we go. But if you were to follow that, it would actually sort of, again, your natural strongest intuition often or can be wrong. It's because we create these shortcuts in our brain. So number 2, our mind's strongest intuitions are often wrong. Number 3, sort of another visual cue. Which circle in the middle, the white circle, is bigger? Left or right? Which circle is bigger, left or right? Probably catching on that they're exact same. If I were to take these away, these reference points, these other circles around them, you'll see that they are the exact same size. If you want to really challenge me, you can like hold up a pen up to it or something that you have at your desk, but they're the exact same size. But what's kind of with this point is because the circles on the left-hand side are bigger around the central circle, it looks a lot smaller compared to in reference to the outer circles, the inner circle on the right-hand side looks a lot bigger. But they're the exact same size. But our brain is sort of naturally wired to sort of use reference points to sort of anchor the ways in which we perceive and feel and experience the world. So let me give you an example. Next slide. Here we are. There's a really interesting study that relates to this, not just as a visual cue, but again, in real life. And it actually looks at Olympians and they sort of the happiness levels of different Olympians. And what's really interesting is that bronze medalists are way happier than silver medalists. When they've done studies with Olympians who have, they're at the top of their field, they're getting first, second, and third. They are the first, second, and third best people at what they do in the world. Like, think about that for a second. That's crazy. The second place finishers are significantly less happy or less fulfilled than the bronze medalists. Even like they did this on a 1 to 9 scale. Bronze medalists are usually around a 7, and the silver medalists are around a 4. So there's a pretty stark difference, even though they were second place compared to third. But it all comes back to reference points. The second place person might have been like, oh, I was so close to being at the top. Whereas the bronze medalists, there's nowhere else on the podium, right? It's just first, second, and third. Bronze medalists are like happy to be there, just to be a part of the festivities and to know that they are third best out of the whole population as it relates to a specific task or skill. So we judge ourselves relative to reference points, and that can sometimes get in the way of our success, of our happiness, of our well-being. Mind mishap number 4. So our minds are also then programmed to get used to things. An example here is if you've ever been in a really, really dark room, or conversely, sort of been in a really bright room, and then you go to the opposite. So For me, I often think of, maybe waking up in the morning. It happened to me this morning as my wife was leaving for work. She had to turn on the lights, and like just this big, like, not used to that experience. And so it took a long time, or took a while for me to sort of adapt, but we adapt to things. So the idea of coming from a dark room to the light, you'll notice that we over time are able to adapt, in terms of how our eyes and our pupils are sort of set, as a way for us to adapt to the environment we're in to be successful. It might be a jolt at first, but we ultimately adapt. So to give you an example of this, I'm going to put up an image you're probably pretty familiar with, and I'd like you to just focus on it, like really intently, just sort of focus on the image for about 10 to 15 seconds. So just kind of sit here in silence. As you do that, I promise nothing's going to jump out or scare you or anything. But just really focus on this image for about 10 to 15 seconds and see if anything happens for you. Keep focusing. Seeing you, Melissa, in the chat. Yep, nope, I'm not going to scare you. But I am going to click onto a next slide here in a few seconds. But I'd like you to still sort of focus your attention, on this flag. And wondering if it happened for you. But two things normally happen. Normally, it's just the slides sort of transition a little bit slower, maybe than I needed to. But I'm curious. One of two things usually happen with this sort of visual illusion. One, sometimes people actually, the colors of the flag, I'll go back for you all, actually start to change. They actually start to go to what we're commonly used to seeing. If you stare at it long enough, our brain starts to fill in the gaps, that this is not the right color. So let me actually fill it in with red, white, and blue compared to these weird gold, black, and teal, or I don't know what color that is. But that might be one thing. You might have seen sort of the shift. Whereas the second, which it seems like is what was just put into the chat, is when I took it away, um, it sort of, the image is still there. It took, like, the image of the flag was able to be seen for just a split second because your mind and your eyes were sort of adjusting. So two things normally happen with that one, to sort of highlights how our brain usually adapts to things, is either the colors change back to what we're used to, and or since we stared at it for so long and it sort of painted this picture on the back of our mind, it sort of stays there for a while. So mind mishap number 4 is that we adapt and get used to things. And number 5 is we don't realize how good our brain is at actually adapting to different things in our lives. We don't maybe necessarily realize how quickly, although a shock in the morning when the light comes on, that maybe our brain actually shifts over to being like, okay, this is my new normal. I'm able to sort of see, or the way that we use the flag example. But to do this, I'm going to highlight a sort of a research study that's out there, that asks people to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 9, 1 being mad, angry, frustrated, not happy, 9 being the opposite, super happy, like feeling good about themselves, etc. If you're to get a grade, and maybe this resonates with you all, because of the context you're all in, if you get a grade that is lower and or higher than you expect, how happy will you feel? So they ask people, if you get a grade that's lower than you expect, how happy will you feel? If you get a grade that's higher than you expected, how happy will you feel? And to sort of show you some of the results from this research, it's pretty interesting. So they look both not only at what they predicted beforehand, but they also looked at after the fact of how happy people actually were. And as you can see, the predicted range, if they got a higher grade than expected, they were really sort of on the upper ends of that spectrum. They were at an 8.27 out of 9. If they got a grade exactly as expected, they thought they'd be maybe around an 8, just under an 8, and lower than expected, they thought they would be around a 4.82. So pretty vast difference, but probably makes sense, right? Like if you're expecting to get some sort of grade, you've worked really, really hard on it, um, and all of a sudden the grade doesn't go as according to plan. Um, you might feel a lot more sad or whatever, compared to if you got a better grade, you might feel super excited and elated. And that's kind of shown here in the predicted. But I want to draw your attention to the actual and to see that there's really not much difference between how people after the fact feel about their grades that were both either higher or lower than they expected or just right at sort of baseline. So as you can see, between the lower than expected and higher than expected, there's only 0.2 difference, which is not statistically significant. Just sort of interesting. So our brains adapt to information because in the sort of predicted, we think that this is going to like devastate us. It's going to be the worst thing that's happened to us. And what we find is that our brains are really good at adapting, that when it actually does happen, we realize that albeit the grade is maybe not where we want it to be, it's not the sole focus. There's not sort of a laser focus on just the grade. There's probably some other aspects or things in your life that are going on that contribute to sort of this overall sense of happiness, but we sort of attribute our happiness maybe to only one thing, or one sole factor is going to be the biggest predictor of our overall well-being, and we find out that's not really true. So just some research to kind of show you that we don't realize that our minds adapt like it actually does. It's actually really good and really resilient. All right. So what are some of these takeaways that we can have, and how does it relate to failure? Right. So first, our first mind mishap, again going back to, we remember the negative more so than the positive. I think this contributes to this idea of setbacks and failures, because evolution wants to keep us safe, and failure is often seen as a threat. So sometimes we avoid it because we are able to pull those negative Zinedine Zidane type examples out a lot quicker than we are to some of the positive things that are happening in our lives. So sometimes maybe this idea, the way that our brain is wired, doesn't allow us to maybe embrace the importance of failure and setbacks, as we've seen, because it's a sort of a protective mechanism, which totally makes sense. The second, although that being said, both on the research, is that failure is sort of a necessary and valuable precursor to success. So again, my mishap number two was that our mind's strongest intuitions are often wrong. And we, again, think failure is going to the lack of failure is going to keep us safe. Whereas actually failure we're seeing as actually a really important and generative quality to life. And so failure is a necessary, invaluable precursor to success, however you define that. Number three, again, mind mishap number three is that we judge ourselves relative to reference points. And the takeaway here is that comparison often makes us feel poorly, and we often use the wrong reference points. And to sort of use a quote that I'm going to tap from someone in a bit here, Brene Brown, comparison is often the thief of joy. So sort of this natural inclination to use reference points to make meaning of the world. Not only is that often wrong, we use the wrong ones, but it often precludes us from maybe embracing this critical and valuable, important of life, that is setbacks and that is failure. Number four is that sort of we adapt, our brains adapt. So one of the things that I think maybe precludes us from failure is we think that once failure happens, that will become what we adapt to, and that'll just constantly become the same thing. It'll become our norm or our MO. And number five is, I think, highlighting the point that we're more resilient than we think. If we were to use the flip side of that coin, our brains, we don't maybe realize they're adapting as quick as it does, or as frequently as it does. But that really shows that we are more resilient creatures and beings than maybe we give ourselves credit for. And so these are sort of five different principles that I've learned from just doing some psychological sort of research about maybe why it is the way that we're able to embrace not only failure, but also well-being or not, and maybe things that maybe we can do with that. All right, so I want to come back to our story of Giga. These are all things that maybe he could use, but it's a weird, funny, cheesy example. But I actually want to share with you that that's actually bits and parts of my life. So Giga is a fake character that I created up, but I used a lot of the examples, and I can go into more about my own life. So I talked about Giga hitting roadblocks as it relates to their first sort of challenge or level in the game, and they tried 20 to 25 times. Um, I've failed and haven't succeeded. I've applied for 20 or 25 jobs within the last couple of years. I've tried getting to that next level for myself in my life and in my career, and I have failed. I have not gotten those things, and I have not moved on. Um, but I've learned from them, right? And that's sort of the piece that came from that research that we'll talk about. But not only did that happen, there's two really significant relationships in my life that have really shifted. And not in a good way. There are ways in which people who are really important in my life, we've either grown apart or there's been something that's happened, something maybe that I brought to the relationship that has really shifted the nature of it, or we're no longer in that relationship. So I shared the example of Giga having two people trying to help along the way, maybe sort of avoiding it and then coming back and they were gone. I've had two really, really vital relationships that I still have to process through that have sort of been quote unquote failures in my life in terms of my social relationships. And then I went on to talk about how Giga, as he sort of reboots and tries things out again, that he even misses little bits of information, things that have been helpful. And so those are bigger examples, but I fail every single day. I miss birthdays of people that I love and care about. I forget little things at work or at the grocery store, and I have to go back. I didn't tell Dylan this, but as we were chatting through the last minute sort of logistics of this, I was actually running to the store to buy one ingredient for the recipe I needed to make at work, or not at work, at home for dinner that night in between sort of my work day because I forgot about it. Or sometimes I avoid connecting with friends who reach out. There's things each and every day that I feel that are roadblocks, setbacks, or failures that I'm experiencing. But what's important is to think about learning from those. That being the critical part about what led people to ultimate success or sort of getting hit and going in this sort of downward spiral or sort of spinning their wheels and ultimately maybe giving up on things that are important to them. So as we sort of wrap up this portion and I want to get into some conversation, I just wanted to share a quote that from Brene Brown, as I shared, comparison is the thief of joy. But as it connects to this topic and to your theme, I also wanted to share, loving ourselves through the process of owning our story is the bravest thing that we will ever do. So again, just sort of embracing this idea that failure happens and hopefully maybe we can see setbacks, roadblocks, obstacles as critical to defining our story, to making it rich, to making it robust, to making it something that we can not only improve the lives of ourselves, but hopefully the lives of others and giving back. And so some of the lessons that we take, how can we hopefully give those back to other people? There's another sort of principle here in terms of what's called the Gi Joe Fallacy. You might not have grown up with this, but at the end of every sort of episode during this sort of cartoon, they would say, and now you know, and knowing is half the battle. And what we found out is that's not true. We know that our brain is wired this way, but we still fall into these old circuit loops, into these old thought patterns. So really what I'm trying to say is that it takes intentional practice, intentional reflection, to have the learning and growth that is necessary to use these setbacks as the opportunity to fail forward, to be able to grow, to be able to evolve, to be able to give back, which I think is ultimately, at least my biggest sort of value, is figuring out hopefully things on my end so that I'm able to give back to others in my own life. So I just wanted to share that, just because you know this information doesn't mean that voila, we've all got it figured out. I'm still struggling with it. I'm still trying to learn from each of the setbacks and obstacles and failures that I've had in my own life. And the reason I used Giga as an example is because there's some really interesting research actually about video games. And that's why I wanted to sort of use that as sort of the fictitious story, because in video games, we often fail, but it's something that's motivating. A lot of games we really engage with, we really enjoy, because there's sort of a safe way to fail that's actually motivating. And there's some interesting research if you want to check it out by Jesper Juul, Juul, who sort of looks at sort of the science behind gaming and how it relates to potentially failure and lessons that we can learn, which I think is just really, really, really important. And then two last quotes before we jump it out. So first quote about failure: every failure is a step to success. Every detection of what is false directs us towards what is true. Every trial exhausts some tempting form of error. Not only so, but scarcely any attempt is entirely a failure. Scarcely any theory, the result of steady thought, is altogether false. No tempting form of error is without some latent charm derived from truth. And lastly, the one that a mentor of mine has often shared with me is, when you're ready, and you may not be there right now, but when you're ready, consider the possibility that failure is a false construct, something you're manufacturing to hold yourself back. And you do not need to. You could just walk more fully into the life you want, and even the life that you deserve. So with that, let's have a dialogue together. I want to kind of see what thoughts, what questions, what thoughts come up for each of you.
Thank you so much for that, James. We're going to move on to the Q&A portion. So if anyone has any questions for James, please put them in the chat. My name is Isabel, for those of you who don't know me. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a student voice liaison at Safe Project. The main thing I'm wondering right now, just as someone with like perfectionist tendencies, I feel like I'm so quick to like label an experience of failure as like very disappointing and not, I mean, it depends on the circumstance, but like kind of go off into my own world instead of reaching out to people when that might be more helpful. So I was wondering if you had any advice about kind of opening up and allowing yourself to be vulnerable with other people while discussing perceived failures.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think this kind of goes back to that one of those mind mishaps that like our strongest intuitions are often wrong. I think when we experience failure or something's going in our lives, we often retreat, we often isolate when sort of counterintuitively. I think that's counterintuitive because actually what we need is to reach out. And I can't help but think. So I mentioned a little bit about sort of the company and the business I'm trying to create, and something that's always struck me, especially since I moved here to Colorado, is the aspen trees and just how beautiful they are, just visually, but also how symbolic they are to, I think, some of the questions that, or the question that you're asking, Isabel, is that the thing that I've learned about them is that they're really resilient organisms, and they also grow in community. So when you see aspen trees, if you're lucky enough to see them or where you are or come see them at some point, they grow sort of together in groves, but it's not individual trees. They're actually one large organism. It's because the root systems are connected beneath. And I think it's a really nice sort of metaphor or example for us to think about. We can all thrive individually, but ultimately it's the connection to others that I think is really critically important, and can maybe serve as a reminder that in those times that we experience those things, that the community is actually the source of strength often that we need, or is the thing that's going to pull us through.
I love that. I'm gonna have to look up aspen trees now.
I got plenty of that for you if you want more research on it or just like information on it.
So cool. We got a question in the chat. What are the best ways to encourage others when they have faced failure?
Yeah, I've seen that. So what are the best ways to encourage others when they have faced failure? That's a good question. I appreciate that. I think first and foremost, approaching it with empathy. I think sometimes when we feel those gut punches, those failures, we think it's only happening to us, or that it's somehow maybe indicative of our character or who we are. And so when I think about the best ways to encourage others when they face failure, is being an empathetic sounding board to potentially share in a way that's productive, right? Don't make the conversation about you, but to maybe in a healthy way disclose that, I've failed, or I'm hitting setbacks, or I've hit setbacks in the past. And what I've found to be super helpful, and I think kind of connects to this idea of the video game research I mentioned, is that if you can separate the failure from yourself. So when you're playing the video game, it's actually you, but you're processing it as someone else because it's a character in a game. So some ways that you can potentially offer that I've used in my sort of work with students is, hey, if your friend went through the exact same thing, what would you tell them? How would you show up for them in this time? And so asking that person to sort of answer in sort of a third person, or to create that 1 degree of separation, can go a long way, because it's easy for things to sort of stay up in our own heads. So creating that degree of separation by maybe asking that simple question of, if your friend or your colleague or whoever is going through this, how would you approach it, or what would you do? That can go a long way for them to maybe build their own motivation or efficacy around navigating that failure or transition that they're facing.
I like that, kind of like a healthy level of detachment.
Yeah. Yep.
So there's another question in the chat. What do you look for in someone who can help you sort through your own mind stuff?
Your own stuff. Yeah. So I'm wondering if that's like me personally, but I think comes to empathy. I find that people who are able to provide a space for me to sift through, maybe ask some challenging questions, questions that are generative in nature, meaning they're sort of growth oriented, I think can help you process, so that when you hit that failure, you don't continue to go in that self spiral. It's really the learning that comes from it that is sort of that, it seems to be that critical piece. Not only from what I shared, but I would say from my own experience, that has been most critical. When I just kind of loathe and think about the specifics of maybe where I fell short, where I wasn't enough, that is a hard pit to get out of. So when I have not only the ability to connect to someone, which goes to your question originally, Isabel, but also someone who then can help me process the learnings and see what are the takeaways, what can we take from this situation that will inform the next hurdle that you're going to ultimately face. I think that's what I look for in someone when I'm trying to kind of go through my own mind stuff as well.
I have a question about new college students, especially those in recovery, can have a difficult time adapting to college life. What would you say is your best advice to those students who want to prioritize their recovery and well-being, even if college life often doesn't seem to support it?
Yeah. Such a great question, and why I'm so happy that the SAFE Project, this Leadership Academy, and all these communities are popping up around the country and around the world. I don't know if it was shared a little bit, but like one of my biggest sort of accomplishments or things I'm most proud of is the ability that I had the opportunity to even like interview Dylan, to create a community for us on campus. So the first thing I would say is seeking out, are those sort of resources there on your campus? If not, are there ways that you can potentially create them? I think the work again that the SAFE Project is doing, this conversation is happening in a more open way than maybe it ever has. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, doesn't mean it's totally open where you are, but we're chipping away. We're chipping away. I think I saw something in the chat or in the questions earlier about like stigma. The stigma still exists around this, but we know how important these communities are, and actually how much it contributes to the overall student population and to the campus community. So as someone who's navigating that sort of first year, I would say seek out if those resources exist. There's a variety of places where they might be sort of hidden and or publicly facing around, but to see that as another tool in your toolkit, and to also trust that to get to the point that you've been at this point, you're more resilient than you probably think. To get to the point that you're even having that conversation, or to think back about other transitions that you've navigated and what helped you get through, because you might be able to steal some nuggets there that allow you to maybe navigate this new transition that you're facing in terms of college.
Yeah, you mentioned stigma and shame. I think those are both like really important things to address.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about just positive thinking. Like, is there a way that people can be too positive and avoid addressing these deeper issues? And how do we keep that in check?
Yeah, there's actually yes. So a lot of the work that I'm inspired by is positive psychology, and the major sort of um, question or qualm with it is that it's just rainbows and unicorns and butterflies, and that's actually not true. There's actually sort of, if you think of any sort of I'll use stress as an example. There's a lot of research around stress that stress is actually needed. If we're just sort of apathetic, we don't have enough sort of excitement or sort of energy input in our day, we kind of become stagnant. But at some point, there's a tipping point where too much stress, we sort of see negative performance. So it's sort of a bell-shaped curve, if you will, where like stress can serve us in ways that allow us to like gear up, be creative, tackle problems, things of that nature. But at some point, there's sort of a tipping point. So it's the same thing with positive thinking. There's absolutely some really wonderful tools that we can put in our toolkit to help maybe mitigate those shame voices that happen. But we also have to recognize that that voice is there. It's not just put dirt over maybe some of those things. It's how can you have a healthy balance and understand objectively, okay, there are good things in my life that help motivate me and push me forward, as well as maybe there's some negative things that I can learn from, and how do those two interplay to make maybe answer the question of where you are now and where you want to be.
All right. So before we wrap, if you could just answer quickly one last one in the chat.
Yep.
How do you cultivate a life where you aren't just waiting for the next success/failure, but enjoying life as it is in that moment?
Yeah, that's beautiful. I just saw that, and thank you for reading that off for me, Isabel. That's such a good question, Melissa. Um, I think it's a process. I still struggle with it as someone who studies and works with people around well-being. I think first and foremost, we have to build awareness that it's sort of a process and it happens. Um, Mindfulness works for some people. Mindfulness, there's a lot of backing behind the ability to sort of be in the present moment and sort of experience things as they go, and then potentially draw learnings and insights from them. So mindfulness would be sort of the quick little answer to maybe something to explore to see if it fits into your practice, but I know it doesn't resonate for everyone. But I think first and foremost, it's giving yourself the grace and space to know that we are creative, resourceful, whole beings that are often navigating a series of transitions in our lives. And as we go over one, we're going to probably experience the next. But hopefully you can create not only a mindset, but a community by which can ground you to the current reality in the current moment.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
It was beautiful. I often joke that when I was on campus, my job was to teach students how to surf and how to like take the highs as the highs and the lows as the lows, yet stay on the board at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's a really great final question. So as we wrap up, first of all, thanks, James. I mean, it's always great to hear from you, and I appreciate folks engaging in the chat. Just so you know, of course, we have some more of these webinars throughout the what is now almost spring. The next one is really going to be, it's also another exciting one about creating empowered spaces for recovery. So those of you who are trying to create kind of an inclusive collegiate recovery program, or one that can, or collegiate recovery community that can work through the tensions that come up when we bring together a lot of different people with different tensions and different experiences. Sam Randall created a beautiful community at University of Colorado Boulder that I think I love hearing her just be in spaces. Just listening to her talk like fills me up. So I'm excited for her to share with you all. And then as always, feel free to follow us on social media. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, appreciate it, everyone. Thank you so much.
If anyone has any final last second questions, you can feel free to ask. We'll be here for a minute or so more.
Yeah, happy to stick around for a little bit if people have some burning questions or thoughts. But I wish you the best, and feel free to reach out.
And they're gone.
They all gone.